Recording is started. You can call the meeting to order.
Okay, call the meeting of this work session on AO 2020-131 to order. Can you do the roll call, please?
Yes, I can. Mr. Rivera asked to be excused for the first part of this meeting. Mr. Weddleton.
I'm here.
I'm sorry, I'm supposed to be informal. Jamie Allard. Christopher Constant.
Here.
Forrest Dunbar asked to be excused. He's on guard duty today. Crystal Kennedy. Suzanne LaFrance. I see Suzanne, but we can't hear you. Suzanne, I think you're on mute. I'll skip Suzanne for now. Cameron Perez-Verdia. Pete Peterson.
Present.
Meg Zalatel.
Here.
And let me try to go back to Suzanne. Suzanne LaFrance. We'll note for the record that she's in the meeting. So you have a quorum, John?
Okay, thanks. So, and I'll watch the chat here if anyone wants to get in the queue. So, who's presenting here?
Deputy Clerk of Elections, Erica McConnell is, and Dean Gates and I are here for if you have any questions.
Okay. Erica?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Erica McConnell, Deputy Clerk for Elections, and I'm going to go through some of the more significant changes in this ordinance. We only have half an hour, so I won't be able to go through everything, but both the original version of the ordinance, an S version of the ordinance, an AM that shows the changes in the S version, and a crosswalk that explains all of the changes in the ordinance. Those are all 4 documents are posted on the Assembly Work Session webpage. So to start, there's a consistent change across the entire title to change the phrase accessible vote center to simply vote center. And this is because the word accessible tends to have a meaning that is not necessarily the meaning that we intend for these vote centers. So we're changing that all to vote center. We are also changing the phrase electronic transmission to fax and email. That is both a clearer term, it more clearly explains what we mean, and it also doesn't conflict with the state elections laws where the phrase electronic transmission refers specifically only to delivery of a ballot by fax or through a website. So we didn't want to have that conflicting term, and we felt fax and email were clearer. On page 1 of the ordinance, we are making explicit the clerk's authority to gather information relating to suspected or alleged election offenses in order to determine whether or not to involve law enforcement. Suspected or alleged election offenses are often reported to election officials and make their way to the clerk as our top election official. And the clerk has to determine whether there is sufficiency to the allegation and then decide whether or not to involve law enforcement. There was a situation in 2018 where there was a Facebook post that where an individual claimed to have voted their own ballot and someone else's ballot, and that was reported to the clerk by an assembly member. And the clerk did investigate that situation, and it turned out not to have merit, but that's the sort of thing that we are talking about in this situation. And there's related amendments on pages 12 and 21 where if the elections team receives more than one ballot from a single voter, that situation could be referred to law enforcement at the discretion of the clerk.
Okay, if I could just hold for one moment. I want to get on the record that Assembly members Kennedy and Allard have joined us a few minutes ago. Thanks.
Thank you. Moving on to page 4, there is clarifications to the section related to how the Assembly calls a special election. So there's a clarification that the vehicle for calling a special election is an Assembly resolution. And then the provisions that govern deadlines is changed to relate to charter and code provisions that relate to timing requirements rather than the 30 and 45 days that are listed there, because those times don't actually always mesh with other requirements in charter and code. For example, 2820.040 A requires that we publish notice of a special election 30 days before that election, but if the Assembly has called an election to happen in 30 days, we obviously can't meet that notice requirement.
All right, can you hang on one second? We got a comment from Dean Gates.
Yes.
Thank you. Yes, just sorry, points of clarification. The change to the required date to publish a notice of the upcoming special election. So this doesn't change what's required from charter and code in terms of, you know, like when there's a vacancy, you have to have a special election within, is it 60 days? So those timeframes aren't changed, but they'll just be listed here for easy reference. The change that Mr. McConnell referred to is the date of needing to publish the notice of upcoming special election. Thank you.
Okay, and Erica, are you going through the S version or the original version?
Mr. Chair, my notes relate to the original version, but I'm trying to highlight the changes that are in both.
Okay, so if I'm flipping through the S version, I'm good.
Yes.
Page numbers might be off a little.
Yeah, I'm sharing the original. I'll switch to the S. All right. Oh.
Okay. All right, thanks. Go ahead, Erica.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On page 9 of the original version, and I apologize, I didn't correct my page numbers. We are proposing to reduce the number of days that a vote center is open during a runoff election, and this is consistent with the general reduction of the length of time of a runoff election. For a regular election, we are required to mail ballots a minimum of 21 days in advance of the election, but with a runoff election, we're only required to mail ballots 7 days in advance, and so it's a much shorter election period, and so we're proposing to reduce the number of days vote centers are open by 2 days. On page 18, we're talking about allowing ballots received from military and overseas, active duty military and overseas voters to be counted if they are received by noon on the day of certification. This adds about 4 days beyond the days that other ballots must be received by, which is the public session of canvass, because these ballots are generally coming from overseas locations, and so giving a couple extra days to be able to count the ballots of those voters appears helpful. And again, we're talking about voters who are members of the uniformed services on active duty and their spouses and dependents who are also absent because of the member being on active duty, and qualified voters who reside outside of the United States. On page 20, we've added an additional reason why a ballot may not be counted. and this relates to voters who are in a state status of ID required. So it is currently possible to register to vote entirely online, but in that situation, no voter registrar has verified the identity of that voter by looking at their ID. So they are given a state status of ID required, meaning that they have to provide a copy of their identification along with their voted ballot. And they get a special instruction sheet telling them this. If they do not provide that copy of their ID with their voted ballot, they are sent a cure letter and given an opportunity to send in their identification. But if they don't cure that issue by the public session of Canvass, we are unable to count their ballot. So that is that new section on page 20. On page 21, we are proposing revisions to why a questioned ballot may not be counted. Currently, when a voter is required to vote a question ballot, they have to sign the question ballot register, they have to sign the question ballot envelope, and they have to sign the regular return envelope. And in addition, an election official has to sign the question ballot envelope. So when you have 4 requirements for signatures, you have more opportunities for accidental errors of somebody forgetting to sign in one of those places. And after somebody votes a question ballot, it's determined whether or not that voter is a qualified voter. And it usually has to do with they maybe moved after the voter registration period ended, or they didn't, they forgot to update their voter registration even though they moved a while ago. And so once it's determined that they are qualified to vote, their regular ballot return envelope is processed as it is for all other voters, and it goes through the signature verification process. So really, if they've signed their ballot return envelope and been determined as being qualified to vote, that should be the signature that is important, and just the lack of one of those other signatures shouldn't disqualify their ability to vote. So we've proposed those changes. On page 22, we have replaced the graphic at B5, just titled the graphic a little bit more consistently, and then we've added information about how to invalidate a vote if the voter determines that they actually don't wish to vote in that race or measure. On page 26, I'm going to talk about both recounts and election contests at the same time. Right now, there's a time period to request a recount, and there's a time period to request or to submit a contest of the election. And both of those time periods start at the adoption of the Election Commission's report. And we are proposing to change the trigger of that time period to the Assembly's certification of the election, because that is a more sort of publicly obvious thing that happens, and it'll be more clear to the public when it happens and when that time period where they can request a recount or submit an election contest happens. On page 26, we are adding a couple of situations that would trigger an automatic recount. Right now, the code talks about triggering a recount if a candidate wins or a proposition passes by a margin of less than 0.5%. So presumably the concept is that if it's that close, we should really double check that it has been counted properly. So we're proposing that if a candidate wins, and this would both be candidate A beats candidate B by less than 0.5%, but also candidate A receives 45.2% of the vote, which is less than 0.5% over the threshold required to win. So those situations would trigger an automatic recount. If in a situation where there is required to be a runoff, then of course the first place candidate and the second place candidate are the two that get to go to a runoff. So if the second and third place candidate are separated by less than 0.5%, then there would be a recount in that situation. And then clarifying that a proposition can win or lose by less than 0.5%, and that would trigger an automatic recount. On page 30, we are adding that tampering with a Dropbox is a violation. And on page 31, we are adding some additional things that are considered voter misconduct, which is consistent with state law. And just after that, we are adding that you cannot sell either your signature or your lack of signature on both a referendum and recall petition, not just on an initiative petition. So those are the highlights that I wanted to particularly bring to your attention. There are some other changes throughout the code, throughout the ordinance, and I encourage you to review the crosswalk that we have provided, and I'm happy to answer any questions. And I apologize if you've heard my cat yelling at me throughout this whole time.
No, that was great. Thanks, Erica. I've got Suzanne.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And a question for either Ms. McConnell or Ms. Jones. John and I have been talking with community councils about some of the changes proposed, and a couple recurring questions concern the specifying the authority of the clerk to investigate any potential allegations of misconduct, and then also concerning the Murukava voters. And so concerning the clerk's authority, for example, in the social media example that you provided, did it cause a problem or slow the process down because it wasn't specified that the clerk has the authority? And could you talk more about how this changes things? And then second, if ballots can be received noon the day of certification, will that be enough time to verify those ballots? Thanks.
So this is Barbara. So Suzanne, I don't think that the example we gave about Facebook changes anything. We like that example because someone alerted us to potential fraud, and we had to go gather information to see if in fact it was potential fraud. If we had found something when we did our investigation, for example, the names of those people, and we had the address because it's in the voter registration database, we looked for that address for voters. And the bottom line was no one voted from that address in that election. So let's say it was just the opposite. And in fact, that voter did vote and several other people from that address voted, including the other person on Facebook. Then we would have the opportunity, and we would have done this in 2018 when this happened, we would have reported it to law enforcement. So we just want to clarify for the code that the clerk is going to do this. The clerk is going to gather this information, and we are going to present it to law enforcement. That is what we are clarifying. We think that this is implied in the code already, that the clerk should be doing this. We just want to make sure that everyone knows this is what we're going to be doing. We think fraud is bad for our elections. We want to root it out. We want to make sure that if someone says anything about fraud, that we are taking immediate action to isolate and separate those envelopes that might be fraudulent.
Thank
Great,
you,
thanks.
Barbara.
Any other questions from attendees?
Just the am I saying it right? Muokava voters, and if receiving the ballots at noon on the day of certification enables enough time to verify the authenticity of those ballots?
So, Suzanne, this is Barbara again. Yes, it's a fairly small number of ballots, ballot envelopes. I believe it was probably about maybe 4 or 5 this year. And it is probably enough time to process 4 or 5 ballots.
Okay, thank you so much, Barbara.
Okay, so we've got the regular version, we have the S version, and that's out now then. So that's on the addendum, correct?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
Okay. And could you talk a little bit about the time frame on, to get this stuff rolling in time for the upcoming election? But when does this need to be done?
Well, Mr. Weddleton, we would like you to pass this ordinance on Tuesday night. As you can hear from Erica, many of these changes, like changing the terms secrecy sleeve or security envelope to secrecy sleeve, really have no impact. They're really semantics. And so we would like to have these changes made. We think they're pretty, many of those are innocuous. Some of the other issues, we consider election season to start on, we try to have everything posted on the website on December 31st. So the candidate forms, those are already posted. The calendar is already posted. There are some voter forms posted. So we would like to have that ready to kick off on 12/31. So if we go beyond that, we'll manage, but I think it would be best for voters and the election team to have certainty and to have it passed on Tuesday, if that's possible.
Okay, thank you. So Suzanne had channeled some questions that we had at community councils yesterday evening, and the Bayshore Clat, we were there, and Jamie Allard was also there. I'm not sure if she stayed for the discussion on this, but some were fairly broad-ranging questions about, voting by mail and its legitimacy, and concerns about, broad fraud and so on. So now, is this ordinance a vehicle to address those things?
Mr. Chair, I do not, this ordinance is really a cleanup ordinance. It's a technical corrections. We usually do a review of the ordinance, which we started after the last election, and we've reviewed it over the summer and talked periodically to the Ethics and Elections Committee about it. So it's not talking about bigger issues. It's talking about super small technical issues. I did see the questions that came through, and Erica and I are planning to provide responses to those, and we could share those with you, and we could also share them with the Federation of Community Councils, so that we can provide some of the broader answers to those questions.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. So we just have a few more minutes here. If there's no more questions, I'll open it up for audience.
John, I do have a question. I'm sorry, my hand was up. It's Jamie.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm just looking at the chat. I apologize. So go ahead, Jamie.
I'm sorry. So I do have one concern, and I really am worried about this. And Barbara, we've gone over it before. It's about signatures, and it's about verifying signatures. One of the concerns was that we had mentioned before in one of our work sessions that it could be abbreviated, it could be even considered nickname. But if we could see that an L loop kind of matches the signature loop, that would be something that we would pass. And consider saying that signature is verified and we can move forward. I take issue with that. If it's not their exact signature on the envelope for the mail-in ballots, I'm thinking that it needs to be verified, either their exact signature on their ID, their driver's license, or what we have on file with PFD. Because I can't wrap my head around somebody being able to abbreviate their name or have a nickname. Can you help me out with that?
Yes, I can. I think some of it, I'm going to have to probably provide an email response to you, and I will. Number one, state law probably requires us, if, for example, my name on my voter registration is Barbara Jones Bradbury, and I signed the envelope Barbara Bradbury or Barbara Jones, I believe that state law says that we need to accept that. If my signature with the state is Barbara Jones and I sign Barb Jones, that also, I believe, is in state law and says we have to accept that. It's the same for Dick or Bill, William, Richard. So common nicknames and hyphenated names are specifically called out in the statute. And one of the reasons for that is I registered to vote 30 years or so ago when I moved to Alaska. And I don't remember what my name was at that time when I registered. So people may signed up as Barbara Ann Jones, and now I'm just using Barb Jones. And that's part of the reason why that's acceptable. In addition, if you look at the code, we have, you're required to do signature verification training, which we have done with the state of Washington state troopers. That is one of their missions, is to teach signature training. And I've mentioned before that the standards are called ACE, and ACE stands for analysis, comparison, and evaluation. So even if my name in the voter registration database is Barbara Ann Jones Bradbury, and I sign B. Jones, the election officials are trained to analyze, compare, and evaluate whether that is the same signature. So for example, if you have a fingerprint, you know, they say that there's 10 points that are really a good example of a fingerprint. And what we're saying is, and what the Washington state troopers have told us, is that a signature is akin to a fingerprint. We don't count to make sure that there's 10 and 10, but we can look at those characteristics and evaluate those. And if there are sufficient characteristics in Barb Jones that match Barbara Ann Jones Bradbury, that is a good signature. So we'd love for you to come in. You can sit through our training. You can watch the staff do signature verification. And we think that that could help people understand how the system works, and that it's really a good system to evaluate and validate signatures.
All right, thanks.
John,
So
can I go?
yeah, just from, so we are past our time. Do I need a motion to extend, or can we just keep rolling?
I think a motion might be fine, Mr. Chair.
Okay, can we get a motion to extend for some 10
Mo-
minutes or so?
So
Move to
moved.
Motion to,
Second.
Any opposition? Okay, hearing none, we'll go to 140. Jamie, go ahead and follow up.
thank you. Barbara, yeah, I've heard that, everything that you said before. That's why I still have raised eyebrows about the situation. I have a really hard time believing that any one person can be trained on expert handwriting analysis, more so than the FBI or anybody else in a short variety of time, even if it's a 1-hour class, 15 minutes, or even one day. So I still want to be able to say that unless the signatures absolutely match, maybe it was 30 years ago you registered, but everybody has to get new driver's licenses. And on those driver's licenses are their signatures, whether it's their ID card, a driver's license. This is just filled with ways that that is open up to fraud. And I just don't want to see that. And I don't believe that the state allows you to use a nickname. I believe it has to be spelled out. But in saying that, I don't want to go into this believing that. I want to be able to have it as a fact. We have a charter, and we should be able to put that in our charter to make sure verifying signatures absolutely match. I don't want there to be anything that says that, oh, well, they signed it as Barb or Barbara or Jamie or J.D. Allard versus J. Allard. So if I need to put some sort of amendment through, or we need to fix that, I'm more than happy to do so. I just want to see where I need to do that, or if I need to, because if that's in the charter right now, or it needs to be changed, or it's in code, I'd like to do that. And if anybody wants to come together with me on that, I just want to make sure everything we put forward is as bulletproof as possible.
So Jamie, I will follow up with you with the state law information. And I think that is all, and I can also provide you the information. I can also let you know that the training, again, from the Washington State Troopers is really good. It's 3 hours of training, and I'd love to have you to attend. I think a couple people have attended. I think Pete attended.
All right,
Sounds
thank you.
great, Barbara.
Speaking of Pete, you're next in line.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I was just going to talk about, this election security. That was one of the questions that I saw that the members of the community council had mentioned. And when we send out election workers to pick up ballots from drop boxes, they don't go out there with one person. It's a team of 2 people to make sure that the integrity of those ballots are maintaining all the way down to the election center. We don't allow people to walk around the election center unless they've signed in and have a guest badge on. We do take security very, very seriously. And I think with this update of our election code, I think we'll be making small improvements to our election system. And like was said earlier by Erica, these are mostly technical changes to make sure we have everything switched over correctly from voting in person 100% to voting by mail. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Pete. And Chris?
Thank you. For my part, I strongly believe in the litigating and the legal history of the Alaska Supreme Court working to make it easier for people to vote rather than harder. And so any conversation about strict enforcement of exactly a signature mirroring something 30 years ago or 5 years ago, I will have very high scrutiny on. And at this point, I don't see fraud, although there has been a pandemic of people believing there's fraud across the country. It just hasn't manifest in any manner that's been proven. And so while people talk about fraud, show us the fraud before allegations that the system that we have isn't working, because frankly, it works and it works really well. And so there's certainly room for scrutiny, and there's certainly room for looking at information and data. And our system is, while not perfect, a very good system.
All right, thanks, Chris. So I don't see anyone else queued up here. Barbara, do we have anyone waiting in the wings to speak? General public?
Let me check, Mr. Chair.
Hello?
I hear a familiar voice.
Of course.
Okay, Mr. Haberman, go ahead.
Yeah, you had a work session. I didn't know you were going to have a chance for public, but I'll be brief. Let me just pull over. Hold a second. Hold a second. Hold a second.
I don't want to hear a crunch.
Yeah. Just to say there's the process is not, I follow the elections a lot of times, as you know, and I'm very concerned on how it's being fair and sure as the votes are going to be counted and checked, and an opportunity for the public to appeal a decision when their vote wasn't counted. And the system is not there like it was even in 2012. So there's a problem there, because when you certify the election, there needs to be a chance for the people to challenge it. It was more fairer back in 2012, although there was a lot of problems then. And also, you certify the election. I remind you, year after year, the Assembly certifies the election. And when you do that, you hear from the public after you certify. So where's the fairness of that? And I'll leave you with that. And then, oh yeah, I would hope that you have at least 2 public hearings on this item, and not just one. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Mr. Haberman. Is there anyone else wish to speak? Hearing no one, we ready to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a great weekend.
Thank you, John. Bye, everyone.